I came to celebrate the most important night of my husband's career. Instead, the young hostess politely smiled and said she was very sorry, but I was not on the guest list. 30 seconds later, security escorted me out of the ballroom as if I were a complete stranger. I did not argue. I turned around, walked to my car, and sent a single text message. Less than an hour later, my phone was already blowing up with calls. Then, the doorbell rang. A vintage Parker fountain pen sat neatly packed in a navy blue gift box on the passenger seat next to me. While driving to downtown Chicago, I glanced at it every time I stopped at a red light, smiling to myself despite the traffic. Arthur had admired that vintage pen for years as we wandered through antique shops on quiet Saturday mornings. I finally found one in pristine condition and paid extra to have today's date engraved on the clip, the day he officially became Chief Executive Officer. At least that was how I had pictured the memories of tonight. The doorman greeted me with a cheerful smile at the entrance of the Astor Hotel. The lobby buzzed with conversation. Polished shoes clicked across the marble floors, and waiters carried silver trays loaded with sparkling water and champagne toward the ballroom. Everywhere I looked, people's faces carried that specific confidence that always accompanies expensive suits and successful careers. I immediately recognized a few faces. Old vendors, retired former employees, the warehouse manager who had been with us for almost 25 years, and a local alderman Arthur had recently met. Many smiled politely as they walked past, though most seemed surprised that I had arrived alone. Arthur had left 3 hours early because he needed to take photos with the board of directors before the ceremony began. That morning, before walking out the door, he had kissed my forehead and said he would see me tonight. There was nothing unusual in his voice. I smoothed out my navy blue dress, the very one he bought for our 30th wedding anniversary, and confidently approached the reception desk. The young woman wearing a gold staff badge looked up. "Good evening, Eleanor Sterling." Her fingers danced across the keyboard, then stopped. She apologized and asked if I could spell my last name. Sterling. She searched again. Her smile faded slightly. She said she was very sorry, but it seemed my reservation was not there. I laughed quietly and told her it was absolutely fine. I explained that I was Arthur Sterling's wife and that I completely understood. She searched a third time. Nothing. She apologized profusely and asked me to wait a moment before disappearing behind a side door. The knot in my stomach tightened, not out of fear, but out of confusion. Perhaps someone had accidentally entered my maiden name. Perhaps my invitation had been overlooked during registration. These things happen. After so many years of organizing corporate events myself, I knew mistakes were inevitable. The young woman returned with a middle-aged man wearing an event manager badge. His expression was cautious, professional, and rehearsed. "Mrs. Sterling, yes, I am afraid your name is not on the approved guest list for tonight." I smiled politely and said, "There must be some misunderstanding as I was Arthur Sterling's wife." He hesitated just long enough for me to notice. Then he quietly reached for the radio, clipped to his belt, and asked security to come to the main entrance. Those words sounded much louder than they should have. Moments later, 2 security guards approached. Neither looked aggressive. Rather, they looked uncomfortable. One of them, a gray-haired man about my age, lowered his voice and said they had checked the guest list. I looked him straight in the eye and asked him to tell my husband that I was here. He pressed a finger to his earpiece, listened for a few seconds, then gave a barely noticeable nod. When he looked back at me, I already knew the answer. He swallowed hard and apologized, adding that Mr. Sterling personally approved tonight's guest list. For a split second, the sounds around me faded away. I turned toward the ballroom. Through the open doors, I saw the crystal chandeliers, the round tables covered in white linens, and the giant screen displaying photos from Arthur's career. And then I saw him. He was standing near the stage, laughing with members of the board of directors. His gaze slid toward the entrance toward me. For one unbelievable second, our eyes met. Recognition flashed across his face. Then he turned away. No surprise, no confusion, no attempt to walk over. Just a deliberate turn of the shoulders as he resumed his conversation. That hurt more than any words the security guard could have spoken. The older guard cleared his throat and asked me to walk with them. I nodded. I understood everything. Neither guard touched me. They simply walked beside me as we crossed the lobby. The conversations around us died down. I caught curious glances, heard whispers, and noticed a familiar vendor whose face flushed with embarrassment before he quickly looked away. Outside, the warm Midwestern evening wrapped around me. I thanked both guards for treating me with respect. The older one quietly replied that he was very sorry, if that meant anything at all. I was sorry too. I got into my car, closed the door, and placed both hands on the steering wheel. For almost a full minute, I stared at the glowing windows of the ballroom, then picked up my phone. One message, one sentence. Immediately freeze the assets of the Sterling Family Trust. Less than 10 seconds later, Julian Brooks, our lawyer, replied, "Eleanor, are you absolutely sure?" I took one last look at the ballroom, then typed a single word. Yes. The first call came before I even pulled away from the curb. Arthur. I let the phone ring. The second call was from Julian, then from Harrison Caldwell, the chairman of the board, followed by two numbers I did not recognize. By the time I turned on to Michigan Avenue, my phone had vibrated in the cup holder so many times that I finally switched it to silent mode. The city lights slid across the windshield as I drove home. And with every block, a new memory surfaced. When Arthur and I founded Sterling Freight in 1992, there was no ballroom, no board of directors, and certainly no politically calculated guest list. There was a rented office above a tire shop, one dented Ford box truck, and an electric typewriter that jammed whenever the weather changed. Arthur found the clients. I kept us alive. I typed invoices after dinner, balanced payroll at the kitchen table, and called vendors at 7 inches the morning to beg for another week of credit. When fuel prices spiked in 1998, and 3 clients defaulted, I sold the stocks my father had left me and poured the money into the company without hesitation. Arthur cried that night. He held my hands and said that someday everyone would know what I had done. I believed him. Years later, when his father suffered a stroke, I stepped back from the daily operations because someone needed to drive Thomas to therapy, sort his pills, and sit with him during the long evenings when he forgot where he was. Then, Harper had twins, and I became that reliable grandmother who picked them up from daycare when her hospital shifts ran long. I did not disappear. I simply became useful in ways that no annual report could measure. By the time I turned onto our quiet street in the North Shore suburbs, the old story had apparently been rewritten without me. Harper's SUV was parked in the driveway. She stood on the porch in navy blue scrubs under a beige coat. Her hair was still pinned up from work. As soon as I got out of the car, she walked down the path. "Mom." Her face said she already knew everything. I unlocked the door and we stepped inside. The house faintly smelled of the cinnamon candle I had lit before leaving. On the kitchen counter sat the baked ziti I had prepared for the next day, neatly covered in foil as if normal life had not just been split in half. Harper placed a glossy program on the table. She said she left as soon as she found out what happened. I opened it. On the second page was a photo of Arthur under the words founder, innovator, creator of the Sterling legacy. There was not a single mention of me, not in the company history, not in the acknowledgements, not even in the timeline of events. He told people, "You don't like these kinds of events," Harper said. He said, "You prefer to stay home." I carefully folded the program because tearing it would have given it too much importance. My phone lit up again with Arthur's name. Harper watched me ignore it. Then she whispered that there was something else. I looked at her and she took a slow breath. She heard her dad talking to Chloe backstage. He said that after tonight, they won't have to hide anymore. The room went completely still. Harper's eyes filled with tears. Her words hung in the kitchen long after she stopped speaking. Their relationship. I quietly repeated the phrase, not because I misheard it, but because saying it out loud somehow made it real. She sat across from me at the dining table where we had celebrated birthdays, wrapped Christmas presents, and once spent an entire weekend putting together school projects. Tonight, neither of us touched the coffee I had poured. I asked when she found out. She looked down at her hands and replied that about 2 months ago, she was at a medical conference in Milwaukee. Her dad had said he was meeting a vendor nearby. She walked into a hotel restaurant and saw them together. They were not acting like colleagues at all. I asked why she never told me. Her eyes welled up. She wanted to. She almost called me that same night. But her dad swore that I already knew our marriage was over, that we were both just waiting for the right moment. I nodded slowly. He had lied to her. I knew that now. She reached across the table and took my hand, whispering an apology. I squeezed her fingers. This was not her burden. It would have been easy to fall into rage, but instead, a heavy exhaustion washed over me. 34 years of marriage do not vanish in one evening. They unravel thread by thread. often long before anyone notices the fabric tearing. My phone buzzed again. This time I answered. Eleanor, what the hell are you doing? His voice carried no concern. He was furious. He assumed I was calling about the trust. You froze everything. Do you have any idea what you've done? I replied that I knew exactly what I had done. He said I was humiliating him in front of the board. I looked around the kitchen, and we had remodeled together 15 years ago. No, Arthur, you humiliated me in front of the entire company. Silence. Then he let out a sharp breath. Chloe thought it would be awkward if you came, so she took you off the list. I approved it. The words were delivered with astonishing calmness. No excuses, no denials. He continued, saying he did not want any unnecessary drama tonight. People expected the new CEO to project stability, and his wife of 34 years jeopardized that image. He added that I had not been involved in the business for years. I almost laughed. I stopped going to the office because his father required round-the-clock care. Then our daughter needed help with the kids. He himself had thanked me for those sacrifices. He said this was different. I quietly replied that it was exactly the same, only now he had decided those years did not count. He had no answer for that. Instead, he pivoted back to business. He claimed I was stalling the transition of power, that hundreds of employees were depending on this. I told him I had canceled nothing, merely paused the process until I figured out why someone decided they could erase both my marriage and my ownership rights with a single guest list. He muttered something under his breath. Then the line went dead. 5 minutes later, Julian called. He spoke carefully, saying he had reviewed the corporate files, and there was something I needed to know. I asked what it was. 3 months ago, documents were filed requesting a temporary transfer of voting rights within the family trust. My heart slowed down. I had never signed anything. He paused and said he knew that the signature on the file did not look quite right. Outside, rain finally began drumming against the kitchen windows. For the first time that night, I realized this was not just an affair. Someone had tried to replace my voice with a signature that did not belong to me. I hardly slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the exact same image. Arthur looking right at me from that ballroom, recognizing me and then turning away as if 34 years of building a life together could be dismissed with a slight shift of the shoulders. By 6:30 the next morning, I was sitting across from Julian Brooks in the conference room of his firm on Wacker Drive. He pushed a thick folder across the polished walnut table. He said he had already notified Harrison Caldwell. The board of directors had agreed to convene at 9. I nodded. Julian studied my face for a moment and said I did not have to do this today if I was not ready. I almost smiled. For most of my adult life, all I had done was prepare for difficult days. The Sterling Family Trust was never created to give me leverage over Arthur. My father had insisted on setting it up after he invested money in our company decades ago. He believed success could change people and wanted safeguards to protect both the business and the family if emotions ever clouded judgment. At the time, Arthur had agreed without hesitation. Neither of us could have imagined that one day we would be sitting on opposite sides of the same negotiating table. The board meeting started precisely on time. 6-8-year-old Harrison Caldwell, with his neatly combed gray hair, looked tired. Opening the meeting, he stated that he wished we were gathering under better circumstances. I replied that I wished the same. Arthur arrived moments later. His expensive dark gray suit looked flawless, but the confidence he usually wore so naturally showed tiny cracks. After a sleepless night, Chloe followed him into the room, refusing to meet my eyes. Arthur did not look at me either. Julian outlined the legal situation first. The Sterling Family Trust was exercising its contractual right to suspend the certification of the CEO transition, pending further review. Silence hung heavy in the room. Then Harrison looked at Arthur and asked if he wanted to explain why Miss Sterling was escorted out of last night's event. Arthur shifted in his leather chair and replied that it was a personal matter. No. Harrison countered calmly. The moment security escorts a primary stakeholder out of a corporate event celebrating a leadership transition, it becomes a corporate matter. A muscle twitched in Arthur's jaw. The chief financial officer, Meredith Langston, cleared her throat. She stated there were other matters of concern and handed out several printed spreadsheets. While preparing the final closing documents, they had identified executive expenses requiring clarification. She pointed to the highlighted items: luxury hotel charges in Aspen, a year-long apartment lease, consulting fees awarded to a PR firm owned by Chloe's brother. Executive relocation expenses had been approved months before the board even voted on Arthur's promotion. Arthur immediately leaned forward, claiming these were legitimate business expenses. Harrison calmly replied that no one was making accusations. They were simply asking questions. I spoke for the first time. I said I did not want assumptions. I wanted an independent audit. If every expense was legitimate, the records would prove it. Harrison nodded slowly and agreed. One by one, the other directors voted. Every hand went up, including Harrison's. He looked at Arthur with unconcealed disappointment and announced that until the audit was complete, his appointment as CEO was suspended and he was being placed on administrative leave. For the first time since I met him at 19, my husband looked genuinely terrified. Not because he lost the title, but because the narrative he had spent years rewriting had just stopped being the only version everyone believed. By the following Tuesday, the company felt less like a business and more like a courthouse. Any hallway conversations died down whenever someone walked past. Every email seemed to carry more weight than it should. Rumors spread faster than facts, and I refused to contribute to either. Julian called right after breakfast. A handwriting expert had finished the preliminary review. I poured my coffee. He was highly confident that the signature on the power of attorney was not mine. I closed my eyes. The confirmation did not bring relief. It brought something much heavier. Someone had decided my consent was not even worth asking for. I asked if he could prove who did it. Not yet, Julian replied. But the electronic file was sent from a computer assigned to the Public Relations Department, Chloe's department. Not proof, but no longer a coincidence either. Later that afternoon, Julian arranged a small meeting room for me at his office. He said someone wanted to speak with me privately. When Chloe walked through the door, she looked nothing like the polished executive I had seen in magazine photos standing next to Arthur. No amount of makeup could hide the exhaustion on her face. She stood awkwardly for a second and thanked me for agreeing to meet. I replied that I was willing to listen. She sat across from me, her hands tightly clasped together. She said she did not know everything. I said nothing. She added that she knew I probably did not believe that. I said I had not yet decided what to believe. She nodded slowly. Arthur had told her our marriage collapsed years ago. He said I preferred staying home with the grandchildren, that I had already agreed to step away from the company, and that as soon as the new CEO announcement was made, the divorce would be finalized quietly. Every sentence sounded carefully rehearsed, not an outright lie, but a painfully incomplete truth. She continued, saying he claimed I disliked public events. He told her my invitation would only make everyone uncomfortable, so she crossed my name off. A tear rolled down her cheek. Yes, and Arthur knew. She looked right at me. He approved it. The words hurt less than I expected. Perhaps because I already knew. I asked about the trust documents. Chloe hesitated. She stated she never forged my signature. That was not my question. She lowered her eyes. She had been asked to gather copies of old corporate documents that had my signature on them. I asked who asked her. She swallowed hard. Arthur. Silence settled over the room. She was not accusing him of forgery. But she was not defending him either. She was simply telling me exactly what she had done. She whispered that she thought it was for the archives. Looking back, she realized she stopped asking questions because she liked the answers she was getting. That more than anything else sounded like the truth. After several minutes of quiet, I asked something she clearly did not expect. Did Arthur ever tell her about 1998? She frowned. No. The year Sterling freight almost collapsed. She shook her head. He had never mentioned it. I smiled sadly. Of course, he hadn't. I looked out the office window at the Chicago skyline, remembering another spring day nearly 30 years ago. We were 3 weeks away from bankruptcy. 2 major clients had gone under. Fuel prices had skyrocketed and the bank had denied another extension. Arthur was ready to shut the doors. Chloe listened without interrupting. My father had left me a modest portfolio of stocks. I sold almost everything and loaned the company enough money to survive. She asked, "You did?" "Yes." I laughed softly. The funny part was that Arthur cried when I handed him the cashier's check. He promised that for the rest of his life, he would make sure no one ever forgot what I did. For a few seconds, we were both silent. Finally, Chloe whispered that she never knew, adding that she believed me. When she stood up to leave, she lingered by the door and said she was sorry, if that meant anything. I replied that I believed her. After she left, Julian returned to the room. The buyer's representatives had just called. I looked at him. They were concerned about the audit. I expected that. They also asked if I would be willing to negotiate with them directly. That surprised me. Why me? Julian offered a faint smile because they concluded that I was the only person they still trusted. Julian's words echoed in my head the entire drive home. The only person they still trusted. I did not feel powerful. I felt exhausted. For years I believed that if I quietly did the right things, eventually the truth would speak for itself. Now I was learning something entirely different. The truth does not always speak for itself. Sometimes it waits for someone to give it a voice. The buyer's representatives wanted to meet the next morning at their downtown office. Before agreeing, I asked Julian to arrange something else first. I wanted to visit the warehouse. He looked surprised. The very first one? Yes. Sterling Logistics had expanded to 4 distribution centers across the Midwest. But the old warehouse in the Southside Industrial District was where it all began. The faded brick building had been renovated several times. However, the smell of cardboard, diesel fuel, and coffee remained exactly as I remembered it. As I walked across the loading dock, the chatter stopped. Then, a familiar voice rang out. Mrs. Sterling. I turned and smiled. Marcus. Marcus had started working for us as a driver 28 years ago. His hair had gone completely gray and his knees moved a bit slower, but his handshake was as firm as ever. He said he had heard I might be visiting. Rumors moved fast. Soon, half a dozen employees gathered around, not because they wanted gossip, but because they needed answers. I told them only the truth. The company was not closing. Several shoulders relaxed. The audit was still ongoing. Someone asked if Mr. Sterling was coming back. I answered honestly that I did not know. No one pressed me further. Instead, Marcus quietly said they just wanted to know if their pensions were safe. That question hit me harder than anything Arthur had said. Not promotions, not executive titles, retirement, paying for grandchildren's tuition, health insurance, real life. Later, the warehouse manager, Brenda, pulled me aside. She said there was something I probably needed to see. She handed me a folder with draft staffing rosters that someone had accidentally printed on the warehouse copier a few weeks ago. Next to several names were yellow highlighter marks. Most belonged to employees over the age of 58. Next to each name was the same note. Position eliminated post-transition. I slowly turned another page, another list, more names. Drivers, dispatchers, mechanics, people who had dedicated decades to the company. My breath caught. I asked if this had been distributed to everyone. Brenda shook her head. No, Arthur had said it was only a preliminary draft. I closed the folder. Whatever happened between me and Arthur was about our marriage, but this was not. That same afternoon, I met with the buyer's vice president, Lauren Barrett. She was blunt. They still wanted to acquire the company, but only if the transition period would not result in years of litigation. I nodded and said I understood. She leaned forward and asked what it would take for me to support the deal. I had spent most of the night thinking about that exact question. My terms are not complicated. She waited. No layoffs for at least 2 years. She made a note. Existing pension obligations remain fully funded. Another note. Health insurance benefits are maintained in full. She nodded again. And absolutely no corporate restructuring targeting older employees simply because they are close to retirement. Lauren looked at me for several long seconds. She noted that these were not financial demands. I replied, no, they were employee protections. Exactly. She smiled for the first time and said she thought they could work with that. When I returned home that evening, another envelope was waiting in my mailbox, a legal summons. Arthur had officially filed for divorce. Along with it came an emergency motion asking the court to grant him temporary authority over the Sterling family trust during the divorce proceedings. I read every page carefully, then called Julian. Does he really believe this will work? I don't think he believes it, Julian replied quietly. I think he is desperate. 3 days later, we stood before a county judge. Arthur barely looked at me. His lawyer argued that since I had stepped away from daily management years ago, control of the trust should temporarily transfer to Arthur so the business could function normally. Julian calmly presented the founding documents, board meeting minutes, and financial reports spanning 30 years. The judge reviewed them carefully, then looked over his glasses. Mrs. Sterling has never surrendered her authority. He closed the folder. Motion denied. Reporters were waiting outside the courthouse. Arthur caught up with me before I reached my car. Eleanor. I stopped. His voice sounded strangely hollow. Why are you doing this? I looked at him for a long time, then answered as honestly as I could because I finally stopped believing your version of our story. He had no reply. As I drove away, Julian called again. The buyers had made a decision. What decision? They no longer wanted Arthur at the negotiating table. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. They're asking if you will represent the trust in his place. The next morning, I walked into the buyer's downtown offices carrying a yellow legal pad instead of a briefcase. Lauren Barrett greeted me with a firm handshake. She said she was glad I came. I replied that I was glad too, and that I would much rather resolve this than spend the next 2 years in court. She smiled. That is exactly what we were hoping to hear. The boardroom windows overlooked the Chicago skyline. Glass towers reflected the morning sun while a steady stream of traffic moved below. Ordinary people driving to ordinary jobs, completely unaware that the future of a company employing hundreds of Midwesterners was being decided a few floors above them. Lauren pushed a revised proposal across the table. They had reviewed my terms. I read every page meticulously. Nothing had taught me more over the past week than understanding the importance of taking my time. No layoffs for 24 months. I read aloud. She nodded. Correct. Existing pension obligations remain fully funded. Yes. No reduction in health insurance benefits for retirees. Guaranteed. I continued reading. A new tuition assistance program for employees' children. Enhanced severance packages after the 2-year guarantee period. Job placement assistance. Independent oversight during the leadership transition. I looked up. This was much better. Lauren folded her hands. We are building a long-term business. Retaining experienced people is worth more than replacing them. I couldn't help but think how differently Arthur had viewed these exact same people. He had started seeing experienced employees as expenses rather than assets. Somewhere along the way, ambition had replaced gratitude. I said I would recommend these terms. Lauren hesitated. There is one additional condition. I raised an eyebrow. Mr. Sterling cannot return as CEO after the deal closes. I did not answer immediately, not because I disagreed, but because hearing it out loud meant a finality I had not yet fully accepted. I understand. When the meeting ended, Julian walked next to me toward the parking garage. How are you holding up? I laughed softly. I keep waiting to feel like I won and I don't. He gave a knowing nod. Justice and celebration are not always the same thing. Later that day, I received an unexpected call. Chloe. She quietly said she knew she had no right to ask, but wondered if we could meet one more time. We chose a small coffee shop. She arrived wearing no makeup, dressed in jeans, and a simple sweater instead of tailored business wear. She mentioned that she had submitted her resignation that morning. I was not surprised. It had been accepted. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. She said she had spent the last few days thinking about the kind of person she had become. For a while, we were both quiet. Finally, she pulled a flash drive from her purse and handed it to me. What is this? Expense reports. I looked at her. There are transfers in there that I questioned months ago. Arthur told me they were confidential executive matters. You kept copies? She nodded. I guess some part of me knew something was wrong. I took the flash drive. Thank you. She looked down. I am not asking for forgiveness. I know. I just couldn't pretend anymore that none of this was my fault. Her honesty did not erase what she had done, but it mattered. When we stood up to leave, she said something that stayed with me for a long time. Do you know what Arthur was most afraid of? What? He was never worried about losing the company. She looked right into my eyes. He was terrified that people would finally realize you were the one holding it all together the entire time. That evening, Julian called after reviewing the files Chloe had provided. The audit team had confirmed unauthorized executive expense reimbursements. How much? Enough to demand repayment, but not enough to jeopardize the company. I exhaled slowly. Good. He chuckled. Most people would ask if it's enough to destroy Arthur. I don't want to destroy him. I know. I just want the truth to outlive him. Julian fell silent for a moment. Eleanor, there is something else. What is it? The audit discovered that several executive accounts were emptied just days before the board meeting. I frowned. Transferred. Where? We are still tracking it. My heart sank. Arthur had not stopped making desperate decisions. He had just started making bigger ones. The final audit report arrived the following Monday. Julian did not email it. He brought it to my house personally. When I opened the front door, he was clutching a thick folder to his chest and smiling tiredly. I thought this deserved a face-to-face conversation. I invited him into the kitchen, the same kitchen where Arthur and I once planned delivery routes on notepads, and celebrated landing our first national frozen pizza contract because we couldn't afford to go out. Julian placed the folder on the table. The auditors finished over the weekend. I sat down slowly. Tell me. He opened the executive summary. The good news is that the company is financially sound. The deal can move forward. I felt my shoulders drop. And the bad news, he pushed a page toward me. Unauthorized executive reimbursements. Personal trips written off as client development. Luxury hotel suites unrelated to company business. Corporate funds used for private expenses tied to Arthur's planned relocation. None of it would bankrupt the company, but all of it violated corporate policy. He will have to pay it all back, Julian said quietly. The board has already voted. I nodded. Arthur had seen this an hour ago, and he had not argued with the numbers. That surprised me. For years, Arthur could find an excuse for almost anything. The silence somehow worried me more. By noon, Harrison Caldwell convened an emergency board meeting. This time the atmosphere was entirely different. No one expected dramatic speeches. No one expected miracles, just decisions. Harrison looked around the room before speaking. The independent audit is complete. He folded his hands. Based on the findings, the board of directors unanimously votes to permanently terminate Arthur Sterling as chief executive officer. There was no applause, only a quiet acceptance. Harrison continued, the transition committee will proceed under the revised acquisition agreement as approved by the Sterling Family Trust. It was over. Not with shouting, not with revenge, but simply with a formal vote entered into the corporate minutes. When the meeting adjourned, I remained seated for a moment, staring at the empty chair across the table where Arthur had spent so many years. Success had once looked so natural on him. Now I wondered if he had always been hiding something fragile underneath. That evening, Harper stopped by after finishing her hospital shift. She looked exhausted. I saw Dad today. I poured her a cup of tea. How is he? She sighed. I have never seen him like that. She explained that Arthur's house felt strangely empty. Framed diplomas still hung on the walls, but the confidence that once filled every room had vanished. He kept insisting that everyone had betrayed him. I looked into my cup. And what did you say to him? Harper hesitated. I told him that no one betrayed him. She swallowed hard. I told him that he betrayed you. Tears stood in her eyes. Not because he fell in love with someone else. She shook her head. Because he spent years pretending your life never existed. For several seconds, we were both silent. Finally, she whispered. He cried. I closed my eyes. A part of me had been imagining this moment for days. Arthur finally facing the consequences. Arthur finally understanding. Yet, hearing that he broke down did not make me feel triumphant. It made me mourn the man I thought. Later that night, my phone rang. After a long pause, I answered. His voice sounded older, quieter. I know I don't deserve your time. No, you don't. I answered. Honestly, I just need one meeting. Why? Not to change your mind. He paused. I need to tell you something before the board wraps everything up. I leaned back in my chair. What could you possibly have to say right now? His response came so softly I almost missed it. The truth. For the first time since this all began, I believed he actually meant it. I agreed to meet Arthur the next day. Not at our house, not at the company. We met in Lincoln Park, by the duck pond where we used to bring Harper on Saturday mornings years ago. It felt like neutral territory, a place that belonged to memories, not lawyers. He was already sitting on a weathered wooden bench when I arrived. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize him. The tailored suits were gone, replaced by a simple navy jacket and faded jeans. His shoulders slumped lower than I remembered, as if the weight he had avoided for years had finally settled where it belonged. Thank you for coming, he said quietly. I sat on the opposite end of the bench. You said you wanted to tell me the truth. He nodded. Yes. He stared at the pond for a few seconds. I didn't fall in love with Chloe because I was unhappy. I waited. I fell in love with being admired. His honesty caught me off guard. When the company grew, people stopped congratulating both of us. They congratulated me. He gave a bitter chuckle and I liked it. The wind rustled through the trees. Every award had my name on it. Every magazine wanted to print my photo. At every conference, I was introduced as the founder. After a while, he shook his head. I started to believe I built it all by myself. I looked at him closely. And when did I disappear? He closed his eyes. Little by little, he confessed that he encouraged the public narrative because it made leadership simpler. Investors liked a single face. Journalists preferred a one-man success story. Every time someone omitted my name, he corrected them less and less. Eventually, he whispered, I stopped correcting anyone at all. We both sat in silence for a long time. Finally, I asked the question that had been haunting me since Julian's call. The trust documents. Arthur swallowed hard. I never forged your signature, but I did ask Chloe to pull old files with your signature on them. I told myself it was just in case the lawyers needed copies for reference. His voice trembled. I knew exactly why I needed them. He did not deny it. He did not blame anyone else. I kept telling myself I wouldn't use them. He looked right at me. But if Julian hadn't frozen the trust, then I probably would have. That admission hurt more than I expected. Not because the fraud was completed, but because he had crossed that line in his own mind long before taking the final step. I became someone I never thought I could be, he said. I believed him, not because it justified anything, but because I had watched that transformation happen for years without fully realizing it. He reached into his jacket and handed me a sealed envelope. What is this? My resignation from the board of directors. I stared at the envelope. It's already signed. I should have submitted it before the audit was even finished. I did not open the envelope. Instead, I asked, why now? He gave a tired smile. Because for the first time in years, I don't want to win. Driving home, I realized something unexpected. I no longer needed Arthur to lose. The board would finish its work. The deal would close. The company would move forward. None of it depended on my anger anymore. That evening, Harrison Caldwell called. The directors had voted unanimously. I listened in silence. The acquisition agreement was approved and the employee protections remained exactly as written. He paused. We also voted to acknowledge the original founders at the closing ceremony. The closing ceremony. I smiled at the plural word founders. A week later, I stood in the same Astor Hotel ballroom from which security had escorted me just days ago. This time, Harrison walked to the podium first. Before discussing financial results or the company's future, he looked directly at the audience. This organization intends to correct a mistake. Absolute silence fell over the room. He turned toward me. For far too many years, we have celebrated only one founder. He extended his hand. Mrs. Eleanor Sterling, would you please join me on stage? As I walked forward, hundreds of employees got to their feet. Not because I had won, but because the truth had finally caught up with history. The closing ceremony lasted less than an hour. The legal paperwork had been finalized for months. The applause only lasted a few minutes. But what stayed with me wasn't the commercial deal. It was what happened after everyone stopped clapping. Employees lingered in the ballroom in small groups discussing pension plans, new opportunities, and their families. For the first time in weeks, no one was whispering. No one was guessing what would happen next. They already knew the company would survive. That meant much more than who occupied the CEO's office. Lauren Barrett walked over to me before leaving. I wanted to thank you for what? You reminded everyone that a business isn't built on balance sheets. She smiled warmly. It's built by the people who keep showing up to do the work every day. I shook her hand. Take care of them. We will. Before stepping away, she added one last thought. I think your husband forgot that he inherited the trust long before he tried to manage it. I thought about those words for the rest of the afternoon. She was right. Arthur hadn't inherited money. He inherited trust, and that was the one thing he could never earn back once he had squandered it. A month later, the divorce was finalized. There were no dramatic courtroom clashes, no last-minute speech. We divided our lives just as we divided our assets with paperwork, signatures, and a long silence. As we walked out of the courthouse, Arthur stopped near my car. I'm seeing a therapist, he said. I nodded. I hope it helps. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I know. He looked down for a moment. I spent years trying to be the most important person in every room. He offered a faint, weary smile, and somehow I became the smallest. I did not answer immediately. Finally, I said, I hope you become a man you can live with. Those were the last words I ever spoke to him. Not because I hated him, but because there was simply nothing left to say. Chloe wrote me a letter a few weeks later. She explained that she had accepted a PR position at a charitable foundation outside of Chicago. She apologized again, not asking for absolution, but merely acknowledging the damage she had helped cause. I never wrote back. Some conversations belong in the past, but I genuinely hoped she would build a better future than the one she had chosen before. A year later, my life looked entirely different from the night at the hotel. Every Wednesday morning, I volunteered at a local small business support center, mentoring women over 50 who wanted to start their own businesses after layoffs, divorces, or retirement. Some arrived convinced it was already too late. I instantly recognized that look. I used to wear it myself. We talked about accounting, funding, contracts, and marketing, but ultimately every conversation came down to something else: confidence, dignity, and the courage to start over. The Sterling Family Trust also funded a new scholarship for students pursuing careers in logistics, supply chain management, and skilled trades. The board insisted it carry the names of both founders, the Arthur and Eleanor Sterling Scholarship. When they first proposed it, I hesitated, then agreed. History should not be rewritten in either direction. Arthur had worked hard, and so had I. The difference was that the truth finally made room for both facts. Harper attended the launch ceremony with my grandchildren. After the photos were taken, my oldest grandson gently tugged at my sleeve. "Grandma, yes. Were you really one of the people who built the company?" I smiled. "I really was." He grinned widely. "Mom says you never gave up." I laughed. "There were days when I wanted to quit." He slipped his little hand into mine. "I'm glad you didn't." I was glad too. Sometimes people still ask if I regret freezing the trust that night. They expect me to talk about legal strategy, corporate governance, or financial leverage. My answer to them is much simpler. The text message didn't destroy my marriage. The marriage had already ended the moment my husband believed my absence would make his success shine brighter. The text message merely put an end to the lie. I also learned that justice is not the same as revenge. Revenge seeks to make the other person suffer. Justice protects what still deserves to survive. In my case, that meant the employees who trusted us with the company we built together, my daughter's belief in integrity, and my own ability to look in the mirror without wondering if my silence made me an accomplice. That night, outside the ballroom, security escorted me through the front doors as if I didn't belong there. A year later, I realized something they couldn't possibly have known. No one can erase you from a history you helped write. They can cross your name off a guest list. They can remove your photo from a program. For a while, they might even convince the world that you were never there. But the truth has astonishing patience. If you protect it, live by it, and refuse to back down from it, eventually, it always finds its way home. If this story resonated with you, thank you for listening. If your quiet contributions have ever gone unnoticed, remember this: integrity doesn't always receive immediate recognition, but it leaves a legacy that will outlast any applause. And if you want to hear more stories about resilience, justice, and second chances, we would be grateful if you joined us.